Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, the place to come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker and welcome to episode 236. Don't make it yours. How to detach from others' reactions. Well, welcome back to a new month and a new year. And as you know, this month we're talking all about how to take care of yourself by letting go of everything that no longer serves you. Especially things that are causing stress and angst and simply are not in your best interest. One of those things, and I think a huge part of your self-care, is learning how to detach from other people's caca. Their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, and their choices. Because if we don't work on this part of the boundary work, we won't be working on our control issues, we won't set boundaries, we won't assert ourselves, we won't stand up for what is right and for what we need, and our relationships will not be healthy no matter what we say. But before we get into that, and especially if you struggle with this stuff, you might want to check out my course, which is self-paced, but it is pretty immersive. There's a lot of material there and a great group coaching aspect that'll give you the support to work on especially this kind of thing, because there are folks in that group, just like you, who are working on taking better care of themselves by setting boundaries and letting go of what belongs to other people. So just go to the show notes. The link is right there and sign up. If you have any questions, send me a message, hit me up on social, and let me know what you need. Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to be diving into a topic that holds significant importance, I think, in our personal and interpersonal lives, and that is emotional detachment. Now, remember, emotional detachment is not about not caring. It's not about disconnecting from our feelings or those of others. Rather, it's about maintaining a healthy boundary between empathy and emotional absorption, making their stuff about us. And I think it plays a crucial role in preserving our sanity and our stress levels, and it is necessary if we want to navigate challenging emotional situations like conflict and things that come up that we have to deal with. Now, why does emotional detachment matter so much? Well, because it empowers us to engage with our own feelings, right? Validate what we feel, what we think, what we need, without, and this is key, being so overwhelmed and swallowed by them. And equally importantly, if we can do that, then we can work on responding to other people's emotions without taking on their burdens. Does that make sense? So some of this work, depending on where you are on the continuum of the work, might be beginning first to notice how you might run from your own feelings. And gosh, if you're still doing that, and there are very good reasons why you might do that for now, you're going to have a hell of a time sitting with other people's feelings and not having a very strong emotional reaction yourself, right? So some of these things that we're going to talk about as well, about other people's behaviors, we might be guilty. And it might be something that we're working on, something we didn't even realize we had to work on, maybe something we don't know how to work on. So if you find yourself in some of these descriptions, it's okay. It is important to work on these things, and there are ways to change them. We just have to be honest with ourselves and get some help. Okay, so we're going to put the spotlight today on a specific aspect of emotional detachment, and that is dealing with acted out emotions. You've heard me talk about that phrase before. These are situations where people express their feelings not just verbally, but through intense behaviors like rage, defensiveness, shame, shutting down, throwing stuff, silent treatment. The list is long, unfortunately. There's a million ways we can act out, but those are the common ones. So we're going to look at these behaviors, and we're going to talk about how to navigate these situations with some clarity and some empathy and some detachment, okay? Now, the reason why we're talking about this is because I think it's so common in relationships. And the very reason many of you probably aren't setting the boundaries you need to set. You're not asking for what you need. You're not negotiating well, right? Because in order to negotiate, people have to have boundaries and detachment. And so it's also been hard to have healthier connections and relationships where there's a high degree of trust and emotional safety, because those two things are crucial if we want our relationships to not only be healthy, but my God, to just be functional. They need those things. Like, these are basic. And I'm not being snarky, but I just want to speak to those of you who may have been gaslit out of that reality by people who can't do this stuff. All right. I'm going to stop being a brat. So if you already struggle with boundaries, you probably also struggle with detachment, letting go of other people's feelings, their behaviors, their choices. Like we've talked about plenty of times on the show before, and we will again and again because it's so important and so simple. It sounds so simple, but it's not easy to do if you haven't done a lot of work on this. What do I mean by act it out? Act it out refers to situations where people express their emotions in a way that goes beyond verbal communication. So instead of calmly articulating their feelings, or maybe even with a little bit of emotion, but it's emotionally honest, it's vulnerable, people can act out their emotions through behaviors that are intense, they're often impulsive, and many times disruptive and upsetting. They serve as a visible and an immediate expression of the emotions they're experiencing. So it's a knee-jerk reaction. Now, here are some common ones. And as you listen to these, I also want you to think about how upsetting these can be and almost traumatic, depending on how they're done. They can be pretty serious. There's a whole continuum of each one. Well, the first one is rage, like yelling at you, screaming, physical aggression, slamming doors, breaking things. So, for example, let's say you confronted your partner over a big expenditure that they didn't run by you. They went and blew money on something without, you guys working it out and agreeing on that. And so you brought it up. Even if you didn't attack them and say, what did you do? You just said, look, I'm really upset that we, didn't talk about this before you went out and purchased it. And they fly into a rage. That's acting out all their fear of, oh crap, I'm in trouble and you're going to hate me. Their fear of not being good enough because they made a mistake. They've been found out. So that anxiety is really, really intense for people. They have so much shame that they can't own their behavior and say, you're right. I should not have done that. Please forgive me. I'll go return this thing tomorrow and you and I can sit and talk this through. Or maybe they even say, well, I was afraid you would say no, so I went behind your back and went ahead and got it. I figure once you saw how cool it was, you wouldn't ask me to return it. No manipulation there. That would have been a little bit more honest, right? So rage teaches you, don't confront me or it's going to go south very quickly. It can also become very scary. This can be really scary. This can bleed into very toxic and very abusive relationships. So if you're in one of those, that's something to really give some thought to and get some help around. Not okay. That doesn't get better. Rage, a lot of times, is actually fear when someone is confronted. And I think it's manipulative because, again, it teaches you can't confront me. You can't bring hard things to me. You can't be upset with what I've done or didn't do. Defensiveness, very common, like becoming overly protective of self, deflecting the blame. Well, look what you do. You spend money all the time. avoiding responsibility. I never did that. Or it's not a big deal. Why are you getting so upset? I'll take care of it. That's a bunch of BS. We don't need to do that. So they refuse to acknowledge their mistakes. They're deflecting any criticism and shifting blame back onto you. And they make the bigger issue that you confronted them and not about the actual thing that you brought to their attention. Probably a very valid concern, a need, a boundary, a request. That's important to remember. What I tell clients when I work with relationships is, if you get defensive with them, assuming they're not trying to attack you, they're just bringing something up that's upsetting them, and you get defensive, you just shut the whole thing down. You have invalidated that other person. You've pretty much given them the message that what they think, what they feel, and what they need, and where they stand on something is crap. And that's pretty serious stuff. Now, fear-based defensive people aren't trying to do that. That's not their intention. They're not even thinking about the other person. They're so myopic, so caught up in the, oh my God, I've been found out. I can't be imperfect. You can't confront me. So it's not malicious. But what we need to know is that whether you are manipulating on purpose and gaslighting and doing the circular arguments and all that stuff, or you're just so terrified of being confronted, either way, you're invalidating that person. Okay? So defensiveness is about the person being defensive. I mean, unless you're being really nasty to them. And I'm assuming if you're listening to the show, you try not to do that stuff. Shame. Shame is another behavior. So that can manifest as withdrawal, avoiding eye contact with you, self-isolating, engaging in self-deprecating talk. Okay, so maybe you bring something up to your sister and she can't even look at you when you're talking to her. And then she shuts it down by saying, well, I'm just such a screw up and I just do everything wrong. Just forget it, right? And so again, that's another way, just like defensiveness, of shutting down the dialogue. So now we can't even talk about it, much less find a solution. And that is someone's shame. That's theirs. That's not yours. That's theirs. Fear. Now, a lot of these are fear-driven. But avoidance, trembling, sweating, heightened alertness. They might even start getting really panicky or really anxious or shaking or crying when you're talking to them. That's their fear and anxiety. That could be what we just talked about, like they're really having a hard time with what you're confronting them with, the fact that they're being confronted, the fact that they're not perfect. It could bring a lot of shame up and probably guilt, which is what we'll talk about next. And so it's too overwhelming for them. They can't hear that. They can't sit with it. And physically, they're starting to show that. Let's look at guilt. There's earned guilt and unearned guilt, like we've talked about on the show. And a lot of people don't even know the difference for themselves, which one is coming up for them when you're confronting them. So they might do the excessive apologizing, like, I'm sorry. Seeking reassurance, like, oh God, do you hate me? Just shifting it into that, where this isn't where we were going to go, but they need to take it there. And maybe really punishing themselves too much. So again, what's important here and why things are being acted out, I think, is because now we can't talk about the thing that you brought up. Now the focus has shifted towards, oh my God, they're not okay. This guilt is eating them alive. They can't handle it. All the things. Understanding these behaviors in others and maybe even in yourself is really important for navigating emotional situations effectively. We need to know this stuff. It allows you to recognize when emotions are being acted out and respond in a way that, yes, is empathetic, which we're going to get into in a minute, but not absorbing, and especially not absorbing the intensity of those emotions, because that's about them. What's about you is the thing that you brought up and how you feel about it and what you need around it, what your boundaries are and what your thoughts around it are. That's separate from their emotional reaction. And I know that sounds so condescending, but I'm not speaking intellectually. I'm speaking to your heart. That's where you have to do the detachment. The awareness of this stuff, I think, forms the basis for setting healthy emotional boundaries and maintaining a really balanced approach to relationships. Remember, emotional detachment doesn't mean we don't care. We can care a hell of a lot, but we don't make their stuff about us. Okay? It means that we don't not confront, not set the boundary, not ask for what we need, not negotiate because we're afraid of what they're going to think, do, say to us, believe about us, and what choices they're going to make. And a lot of that's hard. And I don't want to minimize how big the stakes can be for some of you in your relationships. And that's why if you are dealing with this, get some support around you. You cannot do this work alone. No one can do boundary work alone, but especially not emotional detachment. And you may really struggle with it because of how you grew up and your early relationships. If those had blurred boundaries, if you grew up in a very loving but passive-aggressive family, you're in trouble. If you grew up in a family where a parent raged when they were confronted about something, or dad would grab his chest because you made him so upset, like you're going to cause him a heart attack. I mean, people do some crazy stuff. Or mom would shut down and go in her room and cry. All that messaging was crucial. It said, no, we can't do this. We can't bring up hard things in this family. I certainly can't have what I need. I can't have my boundaries. I can't have my feelings. And so if you grew up in situations where your feelings weren't validated, people didn't have healthy separateness there, this is some hard work, but doable work. Okay. So when you do detachment, you do empathy, basically, right? Put our stuff aside, put ourselves in someone else's shoes for a moment and imagine what might be going on for them. It's a wonderful skill. It's one that we love when people use with us, and we suck at doing it enough for other people. And it's something that you just have to practice. It is not innate for a lot of us. We have to work on it and practice it. But it also is magic because it helps you separate out you from other people. And so that way you're less overwhelmed. And when we're less overwhelmed, we can better respond emotionally to what other people are doing or saying, especially if they're not just acting out, they're very upset. And rightly so. Maybe you just bore some bad news to them. Okay. So what is empathy? Putting yourself in their shoes, trying to understand how I might feel in that situation. And if you're a grown-up, you've probably felt all the feelings by now of anger and sadness and disappointment, and being pissed at yourself, being afraid, being conflicted, being happy, being joyous, being anxious. So if you have empathy for self, you can kind of put yourself in their shoes and kind of think of maybe where they are for the best you can. So you try to pay close attention to what they're saying and how they're expressing themselves. Now, again, this is a lot easier and doable if they're being emotionally honest rather than acting out. But I wanted to cover all of it in here in case you have a mixture in your relationships or some people who do one and other people just do the other. You reflect back their emotions to show that you understand. You're trying to understand. You say something like, wow, it sounds like you're really feeling frustrated right now. Or I can understand how pissed you must be. Or I'm sure it isn't easy to hear what I'm saying. So you're validating them. You're telling them, no, you're not crazy. And what you think and feel and need is not crazy. That calms down their fight or flight, helps them trust themselves, and helps people usually be less defensive. The other magic with empathy is it forces you to not take it on about you at that moment, right? Because then you're focusing on reflecting back to them, which is really good because it helps you keep their stuff about them. How you feel around what they are feeling and needing and doing is about you. Another thing that we can do, if appropriate, if it's emotionally safe, is to ask some open-ended questions, right? Maybe get them to share more about what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. Really try to avoid judgmental or accusatory questions here. Aim for open and empathetic inquiries. So that's when someone's just really genuinely upset. Of course they would be. Let's say, I don't know, you're leaving the office, you're going to work somewhere else, and your coworker's going to miss you, right? You're making big changes in your life and your family's struggling with that. That kind of thing. Now, in order to do this well, we have to recognize the emotions are theirs, not ours. Remember, we have our own stuff around their stuff. Understand their emotions and behaviors, and that's a reflection of them, not a reflection of your worth or your actions. You cannot control how other people choose to express themselves, just as they can't control yours. Each person is responsible for self. Period. You got to set healthy boundaries. Clear emotional boundaries to protect your own well-being here. Acknowledge that you have a right to prioritize your mental health and not absorb everyone else's stuff. Now, every situation is different. Of course, if you had to break bad news to your mom or your daughter, you might want to hold them as they cry because it might be heartbreaking. Okay. But you still have to let them have their feelings. Like even in those moments I just described, you don't want to say, shh, don't cry, it's okay, it's okay. You don't want to shut that down or shove tissues at them so they'll stop. A lot of work on detachment is going to allow you to just let someone cry. Let someone struggle. Let someone beat their head against the wall emotionally for a minute. They have to sit in that. We all have to sit in our stuff for a minute so we can own it. So try to stay calm and grounded as best you can. Try to maintain your composure. Do your 50% of creating emotional stability there if you can. Taking deep breaths calms down your nervous system. Try to stay in the present moment. Grab the chair with your hands to ground yourself, whatever you need to do. Really important when someone's acting out are the internal mantras, is what I call them. And the big one is, not my caca, not my caca, not my caca, not my caca, not my stuff. And I'm not being judgy about someone's caca. I'm just saying that's not my stuff. You have to remind your brain and your heart that that is not yours. Then later, maybe you can graduate to being able to do the of courses, is what I call them. Of course they're terrified. I'm asking for them to change. Or they're probably feeling shame and abandoned. Or maybe they're really pissed. Maybe they're really pissed at me, and that makes sense. I screwed up. Or all of the above, right? First things first, who owns what? Not my stuff. Eventually, you'll be able to get to a point where you're like, okay, I get it. And in a neutral way, saying, I'm getting ready to tell this person this very difficult thing. What is a healthy expectation? They're going to be upset. It's upsetting news, right? So you validate the reality there. Make sure you use I statements. That goes without saying. Express your feelings and your perceptions without placing blame. Like, I feel concerned when, instead of you always make me feel. You don't put stuff on other people. We tell them about us. That's what healthy boundaries are. Ball goes to them, then it's on them. You can do empathy without agreement. You can do empathy without condoning. We hear that, but we forget that instantly, don't we? We have to remind ourselves. Show that you hear them without necessarily agreeing with their actions. You can say, look, I can see this is really difficult for you. You're just validating the reality this must be very difficult. You're not condoning whether they start throwing stuff in the room. And again, it also helps you to not absorb their stuff. It Teflons it back to them. When you do that you statement, which is the only time we should do you statements, by the way, with detachment and empathy, is it Teflons it back to them and helps you to not absorb. And it forces them to kind of look at it in a healthy way. Try to focus on the solution, not the person. Use I statements. Try to detach. Use empathy. When do you need to take a step back? I mentioned earlier in the episode where it can become really toxic. That's when you step back. It's okay to disengage temporarily. Tell them you want to give both of you some time to cool down, maybe talk about it later. Because if this is a consistent pattern with this person where they're always defensive, they get nasty, they rage, they shame, they gaslight you, they shut down, don't talk to you for 3 days, that's not okay. That's a whole nother episode about immature and probably some narcissistic behaviors. And some of them may not change unless that person really wants to. And you don't deserve to be abused. You don't. Detachment work is the just because as well. Just because you bring up a boundary doesn't mean anyone has the right to scream at you. You can't conflate the two. And people do every day, trust me. If they are attacking you, calling you names, cursing at you specifically, or shaming you in nasty ways, that's not okay. You know, it's one thing for people to say, damn, that's hard to hear. Or what? No way. And then come back and say, sorry, you just kind of freaked me out with what you said. That's one thing. It's a whole nother kettle of fish to say, that's a bunch of BS. You're always making big deals out of nothing. That never happened. Okay? Because that person is someone no one can confront or approach about any problems. And they're in such denial and too immature to look at things without professional help. And they are being very nasty to you. And that can really mess with your mental health and your physical health. So if you're in that type of situation, please reach out and get support. That's important. So today we revisited the concept of emotional detachment, specifically on understanding and responding to other people's acted out emotions. We looked at the importance of approaching and interpreting behaviors with empathy, yes, trying to listen actively, and trying to use open communication. The big piece was recognizing that other people's actions are not a personal reflection on you. Setting healthy boundaries ensures that we engage with empathy without absorbing the intensity of the other person's emotions and not making them about us. We talked about staying calm, expressing empathy, and knowing when to step back. And if it's too toxic, getting some big help around that situation. Okay, that was a lot. Again, if you really struggle with this stuff, it's a process. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. Grab the course because the course talks a lot about boundaries, but it also talks about feelings and communication and assertiveness and confidence. So just hit the link in the show notes. It's right there for you to sign up. If you have any questions, reach out. I'm here. All right. Pay it forward. Keep focusing on you, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you can begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.